I'm going to level with you. This is a pretty good way to flatten a board. For this jig, I got a melamine shelf. One of the goals of this is to do this as cheaply as possible. This shelf measures about 2 feet long, and I also got a piece of 4 foot long, 1.5 inch aluminum angle. Total, this cost me about 20 bucks. I scored the aluminum to match the length of the shelf, then cut it using a hacksaw. After cutting both pieces, I cleaned up the rough edges with a file and a sanding block. Then I laid out and marked 4 holes down each rail. I drilled out the holes on each rail, then had to clean up the burrs from the backside with a countersink bit. I didn't want anything sticking up there on those mating faces where the rails are going to touch the melamine shelf. I clamped the rails to the bed, pre-drilled for some short wood screws, then screwed it all together. I repeated the process for the other side and wound up with a very nice flat bed with 2 parallel rails and no gap. Now for the sled. I cut some pieces of plywood to match the base plate of my router and glued the rails on the side, then tacked them in with brads. This will stiffen the sides and keep the plywood bed flat. I cleaned up the glue and checked the fit. Everything's nice and smooth now. It's time to lay out for the slot for my router. I found the center line on that sled, then drilled a couple holes and connected them together with a jigsaw to form a slot. Cleaned up the cut with a file and some sandpaper, then put paste wax on the bed so there won't be any drag as I'm pushing the router back and forth. Now it's time to test it out with a rough piece of reclaimed white oak. I hot glued it down to the bed. That's the reason I use melamine here for easy cleanup of that hot glue. Put the router in the sled, fire it up, and I'm taking it slow at first, just nibbling away a little bit at a time to find the high spot. Then as I take out that high spot, I can work on making it flat all the way across. By taking a little bit at a time, I can move quickly across the face of the board. This whole process only took me a couple minutes. With one face cleaned up, now it's time to flip it over. Here, instead of hot glue, I'm using clamps. I want to reference off that one clean face I made so the 2 sides of the board are parallel. Again, just light passes at first, then following up. What you wind up with is a very flat board with parallel sides. There's some tool marks, but you can hit it with a sander and clean those up pretty easily. There are a couple things I would change if I was going to do this project again. For starters, I would change the configuration of the sled that rides on top of the jig. I'd move the stop blocks in a little bit. That way it rides just straight down the rails instead of sliding back and forth. I would also shorten up the slot in the top of the sled. There's no reason for it to go too far. That just creates a problem where your router bit can run into those aluminum rails on the jig itself. Another thing I might change, I might get some narrower angle stock for the side rails of my jig. If you're working with thinner stock, it can be difficult to get your router bit as deep as it needs to go through the thickness of the sled. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with how this project turned out. It's going to allow me to use reclaimed materials without passing them off as just rustic. If you like this project, take the time to share, take the time to subscribe. Let me know what you think below. How would you do things differently? I try to answer questions when they pop up in the comments, and I try to pass along whatever knowledge I have, as limited as that might be, because I really think makers help make more makers. It's one of the things that keeps me excited and engaged with this channel, and I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to watch.